Hello everyone, welcome. I'm so glad you're here today. Before we dive into the stories of pirate life, I'd love to know a little bit about you. Please take a moment to leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always amazing to see how many different places and time zones come together here to share these stories. Your support means so much, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you for spending your time with me. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore the miserable but fascinating life of a pirate together. Imagine standing barefoot on a splintered dock in Port Royal, Jamaica. It's 1716. The air reeks of salt, sweat, and rum. You're a sailor, barely 20, already missing 3 teeth and half your wages. You haven't eaten a proper meal in days. You've been cheated by your captain, beaten by your boatswain, and forgotten by the empire you fought for. And now a man approaches with a grin and a whisper. There's a ship leaving at dawn, and on that ship every man gets a vote and an equal share. Would you go? Because that's how thousands of men, some barely boys, became pirates. To understand why piracy exploded in the early 1700s, you have to understand how miserable life was for ordinary sailors. Most didn't turn to piracy for glory or greed. They turned to it because they had nothing left to lose. During the War of Spanish Succession, European navies recruited thousands of men, many by force. These weren't volunteers. They were often kidnapped by press gangs, groups of armed recruiters who would drag you from a tavern, a street corner, or even your own wedding, and force you onto a ship. Once aboard, there was no escape. You'd sleep in a hammock inches from the next man, survive on mouldy biscuits, and take beatings for the smallest offences. And when the war ended in 1714, you were dumped back ashore, jobless, penniless, and starving. The ports of the Caribbean and American colonies were suddenly flooded with unemployed, trained sailors with no money and no prospects. It was the perfect storm for piracy, even if you found work on a merchant ship or whaler. Conditions were brutal, captains were often tyrants. You could be flogged for talking back, starved for asking questions, or chained in the hold for falling asleep at your post. Wages were low and rarely paid in full, sometimes not paid at all. If your ship made it back, the owners might declare bankruptcy to avoid paying the crew. And since maritime law was murky and corrupt, sailors had almost no legal recourse. The sea was hard, the money was worse, and the only reward for loyalty was often an early grave. That's why when pirate ships attacked merchant vessels, many crew members didn't resist, they volunteered. Here's what the pirates offered: a vote in choosing your captain, a share in the loot, real money, fairly divided, a say in punishments and plans, and no grovelling before aristocrats or officers. It was a radical idea for its time, a floating democracy. Pirates created written articles of agreement, their own little constitutions. If you broke the rules, you were punished, but everyone agreed on those rules. Some ships banned gambling, others required candles out by dusk. If you lost a leg in battle, you got compensation. If the captain abused his power, he could be voted out. Compare that to the Navy, where flogging and starvation were daily rituals, and officers were untouchable gods. No wonder piracy spread like wildfire. By 1715, the pirate haven of Nassau in the Bahamas had become a republic in all but name. Dozens of ships anchored there. Its streets were filled with stolen goods, cheap rum, and women both willing and unwilling. The British Empire called it a den of criminals, but to the pirates it was freedom. Former Navy men drank beside escaped slaves, exiled Jacobites and indigenous sailors. Race, rank and nation blurred. Everyone shared. Everyone swore loyalty to the crew. Some pirates even adopted the language of revolution. They claimed to be rebels against corrupt empires. But let's be clear, most were still thieves and killers. They kidnapped, they tortured, and they slaughtered. They weren't heroes, but they weren't stupid either. And they weren't the monsters the empires made them out to be. They were angry men, poor, betrayed, and hardened by war. Still, not every pirate found paradise. Some were forced to join under threat of death. Others quickly discovered that pirate captains could be just as cruel as navy ones. And while loot was promised, it was rarely abundant. A haul might bring you silver coins and bolts of silk, but after dividing it among the crew, patching the ship, and bribing port officials, you might walk away with less than a month's wages. And the cost? Constant danger. No port was truly safe, no alliance truly loyal, and the gallows waited for every man flying the black flag. By 1718, the British Crown had had enough. They sent a man named Woodes Rogers to Nassau with a fleet of warships and a royal pardon for any pirate willing to surrender. Many took the deal, men like Benjamin Hornigold, who turned on his former crew. Others, like Charles Vane, refused and went rogue. The Golden Age was splintering. The pirate republic was already dying. But the legend had begun. Most pirates weren't legends. They were desperate men with nowhere left to turn. They were victims of war, exploitation, and empire, who chose a brutal freedom over a miserable servitude. They didn't become pirates because they loved crime. They became pirates because the world gave them no better choice. Music swells gently. In our next segment, we'll climb aboard a pirate ship, not to chase adventure, but to feel the hunger, smell the rot, and witness the filth that made life at sea a living hell. Because the truth is, freedom had a price, and for pirates it was paid in sweat, blood, and broken dreams. You've joined a pirate crew, you've signed their articles, sworn loyalty, and taken your fair share of loot. You imagine glory, chests of gold, freedom on the open seas, and rum by the gallon. But the reality, you're crammed into a damp, rotting ship, chewing on maggoty bread, your skin blistered by the sun, your body crawling with lice. The sea doesn't forgive. It grinds men down. This is the daily life of a pirate, and it was anything but glamorous. One of the first shocks for new recruits was the food. Pirates didn't feast like kings. More often they ate like vermin. Meals usually consisted of salt pork or beef, so hard and dry it had to be soaked for hours just to chew. Ship's biscuit, rock-hard crackers crawling with weevils. Sailors used to say, "Bite in the dark so you don't see what wriggles." Peas and beans, long past their prime, mushy and sour. Fresh food was rare. Unless they raided a ship or stopped at an island, pirates went weeks without fruit or vegetables, which meant scurvy. Scurvy was the sailor's plague. Gums swelled and bled. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old wounds opened again. Men became weak, delirious, and eventually died. It's estimated scurvy killed more sailors than battles ever did. And the drink? Water turned foul within days. It stank of algae and rot. The safer option was beer or rum, so pirates drank constantly. A gallon of rum per day wasn't unheard of. It dulled the hunger. It dulled the pain, but it also fueled brawls, madness, and disease. Life aboard was a petri dish of sickness. Dysentery swept through crews like wildfire, spread by contaminated food and water. Sailors called it the flux, and it left men writhing, dehydrated, sometimes dead. Venereal diseases, syphilis, gonorrhea, were common, carried from port to port. Pirates treated them with mercury, which poisoned them slowly. Fever and infections from even small cuts were deadly. There were no antibiotics, no clean bandages, no sterile knives. And when wounds needed treatment, the ship's surgeon, often just a carpenter or cook with a strong stomach, would saw off limbs without anesthesia. The screams carried across the waves, followed by the smell of burned flesh, as wounds were cauterized with boiling oil or gunpowder. Pirates lived in constant pain. The ones who didn't die carried scars that never healed. Even without wounds, your body suffered. Clothes were rarely washed. Salt rubbed skin raw. Lice and fleas infested hair and beds. Rats gnawed through grain sacks and sometimes through flesh. And the environment was merciless. In the tropics, the sun blistered skin and baked men to exhaustion. In storms, waves crashed over decks, soaking hammocks, turning everything into a swamp. In the North Atlantic, the cold was brutal. Fingers stiffened, frostbite crept in, and hypothermia stole men in their sleep. There was no comfort, no privacy, no escape. You lived in the same cramped quarters as dozens of men, and you smelled them day and night, sweat, smoke, rum, vomit, rot. The stench was overwhelming. Despite their image as rebels, pirate ships weren't lawless. They demanded constant labour. Sails had to be trimmed, masts repaired, leaks patched, bilges pumped. Men hauled ropes until their hands bled. They climbed rigging in storms, with the wind shrieking and waves hammering, knowing one slip meant death. When not working, pirates scraped barnacles from hulls, polished weapons, or stood watch through the night. Rest was a luxury. And discipline? Pirates voted on their rules, but once agreed, they were enforced with brutal strictness. If you were caught stealing from the crew, you could be whipped, marooned, or even executed. Laziness wasn't tolerated. The mix of boredom, hunger, and rum was explosive. Disputes often ended in fights, fists, knives, even pistols. Some pirate codes allowed duels to settle arguments. Others demanded punishments chosen by the crew. Mutiny was always a threat. A captain who grew too arrogant or cowardly could be voted out or killed. Pirate democracy was fragile, and blood was often the price of keeping order. So why did they do it? Why endure the filth, the hunger, the disease? Because compared to the navy or merchant service, piracy still offered a kind of freedom, a say in your fate, a fairer share of loot, and the chance, slim though it was, of a fortune that could buy you out of misery. Most pirates never saw that fortune, but the hope of it was enough to keep men climbing the rigging, gnawing on biscuits, and downing their rum. Hollywood paints pirates as bold adventurers, swaggering across decks with clean shirts and bright smiles. The truth? Most were toothless, scarred, half-drunk, and constantly sick. Their daily life wasn't treasure hunts and daring battles. It was rot, hunger, pain. They weren't free spirits living in paradise. They were men trapped on floating prisons, bound together by desperation, greed, and fear. The sound of waves fades into ominous silence, and as we'll see in our next segment, if disease or hunger didn't claim them, another fate always loomed larger, the hangman's noose. Because pirates didn't just live miserably, they died miserably. They called piracy a life of freedom, but every man who hoisted the black flag knew the truth. Death was always waiting. Sometimes it came with a cannon blast, sometimes with fever, but most often it came with a rope. This is the story of how pirates lived under constant fear of death. Pirates weren't kings of the sea, they were prey. The British, Spanish, French, and Dutch empires all sent warships to hunt them down. Naval captains were paid bounties for captured pirates, and merchants hired heavily armed escorts. Even privateers, once fellow outlaws, turned pirate hunters when governments paid them better. For every pirate raid that succeeded, there was always the risk of being cornered by a man of war. These ships were bigger, faster, and packed with trained marines. Take Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. He terrorized the American coast, blockaded Charleston, and filled taverns with his legend. But in 1718, the Royal Navy sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard after him. Blackbeard fought like a demon, swords clashing, pistols firing. But when the smoke cleared, he was riddled with bullets and cut down. His head was hung from Maynard's bowsprit as proof. It was a message. This is how every pirate ends. If you were captured alive, you faced the Admiralty courts. There was little chance of mercy. Pirates were branded as the enemies of all mankind. Trials were swift, sentences certain, and the punishment? Hanging. At London's execution dock, pirates were marched through jeering crowds with ropes around their necks. Some wept, some cursed. A few laughed, defiant to the end. The gallows stood by the river, so the tide could wash over the bodies. Sometimes men hung for hours, even days, until their corpses were black with rot. Afterwards, their bodies were coated in tar and suspended in chains, a practice called gibbeting. For years, the skeletons of pirates swayed above harbours as warnings. Ordinary sailors would pass beneath, staring at what might be their own future. It was a terror more effective than any cannon. Death didn't always come from the navy. Sometimes it came from their own kind. Pirates lived by codes, but those codes were ruthless. Theft from the common stock could mean whipping, branding, or marooning. A slow death on a deserted island. Mutiny could mean execution on the spot. And then there were punishments meant to terrify, keel hauling, where a man was dragged under the ship's barnacle-covered hull, his skin shredded to ribbons. Marooning, abandoned with a bottle of water and a pistol, left to starve or go mad. Pirates feared these punishments as much as the hangman's noose. A single mistake, a bad argument, or even bad luck could end your life at the hands of your own crew. Even without law or justice, the sea itself was deadly. Storms could rise in minutes, tearing sails, snapping masts, and throwing men into the black water. Pirates sailed in small, nimble sloops, not sturdy warships. A hurricane could splinter them to kindling. Shipwreck was common, and for men who couldn't swim, and most sailors couldn't, the ocean was a grave. Drowning was quick, but it was every sailor's nightmare. Bodies washed ashore for days after a storm, reminders that the sea claimed as many pirates as any gallows. The greatest fear wasn't always the navy or storms. It was betrayal. Pirates lived in a world where loyalty was paper thin. A shipmate could sell you out for a pardon. A governor who promised safe harbour might hand you to the authorities. Even fellow captains turned informants. In 1718, King George I offered pardons to pirates who surrendered, many accepted, but some became pirate hunters themselves. Men like Benjamin Hornigold, once a notorious captain, turned on his old comrades to save his own skin. Imagine living every day wondering if the man beside you would betray you tomorrow. That paranoia weighed heavier than any chain. Most pirates didn't live long. Historians estimate the average career lasted barely 2 years. Few lived to see old age. Many didn't live to see 30. Their lives were measured not in years, but in raids, each one a roll of the dice. One day you might capture a Spanish galleon loaded with silver. The next you might be cut down by musket fire, or chained in a prison cell awaiting the gallows. And pirates knew it. They drank harder, fought harder, lived faster, because they had no future to plan for. Every sunrise was borrowed time. The truth is, pirates didn't just fear death. They lived with it, slept beside it, breathed it in every storm and cannon volley. Death was in the sickness that spread through the hammocks. Death was in the bottle of rum passed from hand to hand. Death was in the eyes of the hangman waiting at the dock. Some faced it bravely, some broke, but none escaped it. Because for all the legends, for all the black flags and silver coins, the pirate's life was always leading here, toward the noose, the sea, or the grave. When we think of pirates, we imagine hidden chests of gold, maps marked with an X, and a long triumphant life of freedom. But the truth? Most pirates never lived long enough to bury treasure, let alone enjoy it. Their final days weren't filled with glory. They were filled with betrayal, poverty, and despair. This is the true ending of the pirate's story. Let's start with the biggest myth: treasure maps and buried gold. In reality, pirates almost never buried their loot. Why? Because most of it wasn't gold at all. It was food, cloth, rum, and trade goods, things you couldn't bury without ruining them. And the coins they stole were usually spent as quickly as possible on rum, gambling, or bribing officials. The idea of buried treasure was popularized by stories like Treasure Island centuries later. The truth was far less romantic. Pirates lived fast and squandered faster. Very few died rich, and those who did usually took their secrets to the grave without any maps. For many pirates, the only escape was surrender. Throughout the early 1700s, governments offered pardons to pirates willing to renounce their crimes. Some took the deal, hoping to return to normal life. But the world didn't forgive so easily. Pardoned pirates struggled to find honest work. Few merchants would trust them, few ports would welcome them. Many slipped back into crime or were hunted down anyway. One example is Charles Vane. Offered a pardon, he refused. Captured after years of running, he was hanged in 1721. Another, Benjamin Hornigold, accepted his pardon and even hunted his former comrades. Yet his reputation was ruined and he died shipwrecked, largely forgotten. The lesson was clear. Whether you accepted the king's mercy or defied it, the end was rarely kind. Some pirates tried to disappear. They hid under false names, married into local families, or worked as fishermen. A handful survived this way, but most lived in constant fear of recognition. Alcoholism was rampant. Years of drinking rum and living in excess left many broken in body and mind. Violence followed them ashore. Some couldn't escape the life. They fought, stole, and killed until the gallows claimed them. Others withered away in obscurity. Once feared across oceans, they ended as beggars in port towns, forgotten by history until legends resurrected their names. Let's look at a few famous endings. Black Bart Roberts was one of the most successful pirates of all time, capturing hundreds of ships. But in 1722 he was killed in battle, shot in the throat by grape shot. His men, rather than see his body taken, wrapped him in sails and cast him into the sea. Calico Jack Rackham, remembered mostly for sailing with Anne Bonny and Mary Red, was captured in Jamaica and hanged in 1720. His body was displayed as a warning, tarred and chained. Anne Bonny and Mary Red themselves met uncertain fates. Red died in prison, likely of fever. Bonny's ending is shrouded in mystery. Some records suggest she was released, married, and lived quietly. Others say she returned to piracy under another name. For every legend there were hundreds of nameless pirates whose bones were left in unmarked graves or at the bottom of the sea. Perhaps the greatest symbol of piracy's end was Nassau, the pirate stronghold in the Bahamas. For years it had been a haven, a place where pirates ruled themselves free from kings and navies. But in 1718, Woodes Rogers, the British governor, arrived with warships and royal authority. He offered pardons to those who surrendered and hunted the rest. Nassau was transformed from a lawless republic into a British colony. The pirate dream was over. Without safe havens, without allies, pirates became fugitives with nowhere to hide. The so-called Golden Age of Piracy ended within a generation. Even for those who survived, the toll was heavy. Imagine living every day knowing death stalked you. Imagine being hunted by the empire you once served, betrayed by your friends, and remembered only as a criminal. Some pirates faced the end with bravado, laughing at the gallows. Others begged for mercy. But all of them knew that the world would not mourn them. Their names would live on only as warnings. So what was the pirate's final legacy? Not buried treasure, not endless freedom, but a fleeting rebellion against a cruel world. A dream that burned brightly for a moment, then collapsed into blood, chains, and broken bones. For most, the pirate's life ended not with triumph, but with silence, a nameless grave, a skull bleaching under the sun, and yet, centuries later, their stories endure, not because of the riches they won, but because of the misery they endured. They remind us that the promise of freedom is fragile, that every rebellion carries its cost. The pirate's life was many things, brutal, short, miserable, but never forgotten. Never